pass over to Mia to ask the first question.
Yeah, so the first question is, what made you become an activist for your cause?
Oh, that's a very difficult one, because it's a very long one. I think one of the things I have to say is that it's rooted in my family history. Um, I was brought up in a Jewish family, not very religious, but very political. And actually, amongst that generation of Jews, there was a long tradition of being activists. I mean, many of them had emigrated from Eastern Europe 1 or 2 generations before, and there's a very long tradition of Jews organizing against their rulers, who were very oppressive in those days, and they led trade union movements. So that tradition got passed down through my father, who was a member of the Communist Party in the 30s, which was quite an extreme thing to be in those days. And I don't ever remember him preaching at me or anything like that, but I obviously picked up those kinds of political interests and values. So I came out of that, I think, through my teens and as I grew up into an adult, just assuming that I would get involved in political activity of various kinds. And it just, I think most of it just followed from there, really. I mean, do ask me more about that, or whether there were other things, but that's the first thing that always comes into my mind.
Thanks, Bernard. How did that sort of move on to like youth work?
Well, I can almost give you it to the exact date, but certainly to the month. In September, hold your breath. In September 1948, just after my 13th birthday, I joined a youth club for the first time. And again, there was a family tradition there, because my father had been very, very involved with that youth organization when he was young, not anymore at that time, but certainly in the past. And 2 or 3 years after I'd become a member, it got its first full-time youth leader, a man called Stanley Rowe, who was an absolutely inspirational figure. Absolutely inspirational, nationally as well. And he was, for example, and this is not irrelevant, he was the honorary secretary of one of the very few trade unions for youth workers at the time. So I picked that up. But he also had a very strong commitment of nurturing young people as they got older to take on jobs, to take responsibility, and he offered training and support and for that kind of thing. And so by the time I went to university, actually I did national service, and so I was 20 before I went to university. And by the time I did that, I had his tradition of fighting for youth work very much embedded in me. And actually, after I did my degree, I went and trained as a youth worker. And even in the year that I was still a student there, I became, quotes, the research officer of the youth work trade union. And so I track back many of my commitments to fighting for youth work back to Stanley Rowe, who was my mentor above all else, an incredible figure. And not just me, there were, and probably still are, youth workers and social workers and teachers around who would be saying exactly the same thing. I got started on this path because of Stanley Rowe.
You might have answered that question then, but I think Muskan's got the next one.
Yeah, what or who inspires you?
What inspired me? Well, I mean, in terms of people and youth work, Stanley Rowe was certainly the most important influence of all. But in the end, if I look back, it was because of what youth work did for me that meant that I couldn't let go of it in a way. And certainly as I went through my training and began to work with young people as a youth worker, I discovered just how valuable it could be for them. And the other thing I discovered really quite early on was that many of those young people were discovering their possibilities through youth work when they'd been put down by schools, when they, had a very negative experience. When I was doing some youth work many years ago in Leyland in Lancashire, I very quickly discovered that when I began to talk about a young woman who was really active and very positive in the club, the teacher I was talking to didn't recognize her. It was a completely different human being that she knew and that I was talking about. So it was those possibilities, I think, that emerged quite early from the out of youth work that inspired me to want to go on being involved with it. Is that okay, Muskan? I mean, does that do enough of what next?
So
you're all muted.
I think it's me next. Have you
Yeah, right,
encountered have you encountered any challenges on your campaign journey?
Wow. Well, I think if we're talking specifically about youth work, then the biggest challenge, I guess, has always been how underrated and played down youth work is, alongside other kinds of ways in which our society tries to engage with young people, and really felt challenged to try and explain to them what it is that's special about youth work. And that is quite difficult, you see, because, well, and I don't need to tell you, but certainly from my experience, if you ask a teacher, what are you trying to do, they can either say, well, I'm trying to teach somebody geography, or I'm trying to get them through their A-level exams, or whatever it might be. If you talk to somebody about youth work, I mean, what I find myself saying is, well, it depends what the young person wants out of it, really. I mean, I don't know what that might lead to until I've met that young person or that group of young people, more likely, with their friends, and got to know them, and we've built up some trust, hopefully, and they've begun to think, well, we might begin to open up to this guy, or woman, as obviously in many cases, and explaining that to people always seems very vague and a bit kind of, oh, well, you're ducking the question, really. And yet, for me, it's the absolute reality of. So that's one of the biggest challenges. The other challenge, I have to say, and this is where we might, when we begin to talk about youth spaces, I don't know whether you recognize it, but I can remember being in youth clubs as a youth worker over many years, and suddenly realizing that there's a group of young people who come in for the first time, and they're sitting over there in the corner by the coffee bar, and the music's on, and so on and so on, and saying to myself, I need to go over to those young people and say hello and make them feel at home, and steeling myself and getting over my nervousness and walking across the room and saying, hi, how you doing? I always find that a real challenge,
Thanks, Bernard. Have you got any examples of maybe any challenges that you faced in other types of activism? Because I know you've been involved in a lot of campaigns and you're interested in a lot of activism.
Yeah, very different.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No. Well, no, I've thought about some of these things. There's one area of my activism that I was determined to get to talk about. I think probably one of the most challenging things I've ever done is when in 2009, with a group, including Sally, my wife, we went to Palestine for 10 days. And I wouldn't for a minute want to give you the impression that we'd lived over those 10 days as Palestinians did. But we did experience bits of their experience. We would stand at a checkpoint, for example, which was being run by Israeli soldiers with big guns slung over their shoulder, and who had no intentions of being polite to anybody who came through. And because we were British, spoke a different language, had a British passport and so on, we would make it through. But I've sat on a bus, for example, with our Palestinian guide and watch him being taken off the bus, and I find those kinds of things, that particular experience, I wouldn't have missed that experience for anything. It's been one of the most telling bits of experience I've had in my life, those 10 days, 12 years ago. But it also had some really, really challenging moments, I have to say. And can I say all that as somebody who's got this Jewish background and yet cannot bear what the Israelis are doing in the name of a Jewish state. It just is absolutely against everything I stand for.
Thank you, Bernard. I think we're back to Mia for the next question.
Yeah, back to me. So my question is, how do you deal with criticism, and like how do you work through when you get criticized?
Well, I've got a couple of quotes here from my dad, which are always the things that I kind of try to hold on to. One of them is, that next question that you're asked could turn out to be much more important than the last answer. And the other one, which is, if life's a puzzle, does it always have to be completed? Does it always have to be, kind of got right? I mean, those are important for me because, and I don't live up to them all the time, and I don't live up to all my aspirations, but I do try to hold on to the fact that human, especially human relationships and all the kinds of things that we're involved in when we're campaigning are very complicated, and there are some bottom line values and beliefs that I hold to, and I will not cross those lines. But nonetheless, beyond those lines, there will always be questions to be asked, which will be more important than the last answer. And so if someone comes back to me and says, don't like the way you did that, or some things there that weren't finished, I'd like to try and hold on to the idea that there is much more to this than perhaps I realized, or I understood, or I took into account, and I need to just stand back and have another look at it. The other thing I would just add to that I became really quite conscious of and wrote one or two things about, actually, quite late on in my career, is I hold on to this word doubt. Not doubts, which are not quite the same thing, but this quality of being doubtful about things, so that nothing ever need necessarily get to the final answer, but you can come back to it and say, well, not too sure about that. So those are the kinds of things that I hope have helped me to be able to deal with criticism. I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that I'm a bit of a temper sometimes as well. That doesn't always help. But nonetheless, those are the kinds of principles anyway that I try to hold to. I mean, is that okay? I mean, does that kind of address the question?
Yeah, I think sums it up perfectly. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
So gonna pop back to Muskan, but I know she's been having some Wi-Fi issues. So if Muskan, are you there, Muskan?
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's your question.
What different campaigning methods have you used?
Well, one of the bottom lines for me here has always been, if you can do it together, you're much more likely to be effective and have some impact than if you simply think you can do it as some private individual doing it on their own. So one of the things that I've always worked for and try to support has been what I call collective action, and that means people with the same ideas, shared values, the similar kinds of aims for what they want to do, Those people getting together and talking it through, and then working out from there what the next methods might be. I mean, on rare occasions, I've been involved in it's not been my top kind of method in what you might call direct action, not violent action, but I can remember many years ago being involved in something related to the campaign for nuclear disarmament, going back many years, in a sit down in Trafalgar Square, for example. You know, so I don't rule those kinds of methods out, but in the end, my methods are, I suppose, very much related to trying to persuade people with facts, with information, with arguments, through meetings. For example, there's a group here in Leamington that's very committed to trying to raise the issues of the Palestinians to the wider public. And before COVID, we held a vigil outside the town hall every Saturday morning. We've held meetings outside the town hall, and I've spoken at them. You know, so it's on the whole. And of course, a lot of, you probably know that I've done quite a lot of writing, particularly around youth work and youth work subjects. And a lot of my writing is about trying to give people information, give them, stimulate them to think, have ideas, particularly give them opportunities to be critical of the powers that be and the people who hold the purse strings and those kind of things. So try to feed into debates in those kind of ways. They're not everybody's way of working, but I think those probably been pretty prominent for me actually over the years. I think that's right. There are probably other things I'll think of afterwards, but that's what comes to the top of my head immediately anyway.
Thank you. And I think the final question from the panel, so all attendees, if you start thinking about some questions that you'd like to ask Bernard, I think we're back to Steph to ask this question, which I know Bernard will find difficult to answer.
What are you most proud of?
Oh yes, that question was on your prompt list for your activism, wasn't it? And I found that really difficult. Well, I think that bit about going to Palestine, actually, I don't know whether proud's the right word, but certainly it's one of the experiences that I hold on to as most precious. I mean, I think that is, and you know, it's a strange thing to say because it was incredibly uncomfortable in lots and lots of ways, but nonetheless, I as I said before, I wouldn't have missed it. I suppose if you really push me, then it would be still trying to make a contribution many years later, you know, and never, I suppose, and what that means is never quite giving up, even though there have been lots of setbacks. And if I talk particularly about what's happened to youth work and youth clubs over the last 10 years, 12 years, with all the money that's been taken away and so on, it would have been very easy to throw up hands in despair and say, what we're bothering. And yet, you know, there's still a group of us, has been a group of us who have kept at it for 10 years or more, and won little victories here and there as well, I think, and begun to convince people. So I think it's that persistence that as much as anything that I would hope people would see as valuable. Okay.
That's great, thank you. So we do have some questions coming in from attendees, which is amazing. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to follow sort of a similar format where Mia, Stephanie and Muskan will read the questions out, but these ones you won't have been able to prepare for, Bernard, so they might put you on the spot a bit. Okay. But straight to Mia, if you want to ask the first one.
Yeah, that's fine. So the first one's from Laura. If you hadn't had the experiences you'd had when younger that sparked a relationship with youth work, do you think you'd still found yourself involved in activism the way you are now? And if you could have a conversation with your 13-year-old self to prepare them to get involved with campaigning and activism, what would you tell them?
Oh my God. So what the first part of the question again, Mia, was?
Oh, hold on. Ellie got rid of me. Give me a second. If you hadn't had the experiences you'd had when you were younger that sparked a relationship with youth work, do you think you'd still found yourself involved in activism in the way you are now?
I think that's probably, well, how do we know? How do we know? I mean, I'm guessing here. But I think the most likely thing is that yes, in some way, because of that family tradition that I came out of. And it was a very, very deep-seated family tradition, and it was a tradition. I mean, in the 20s, for example, my father had lost jobs because he was known to be a member of the Communist Party. So it wasn't just superficial; it was deep there in our family, and also in the wider family as well. There were other family members who were quite committed politically. So taking that tradition, taking hold of that tradition, I think probably in some way or other, I would have been politicized anyway. I think my word is much more politicized, you see, than thinking myself as an activist, although obviously the activism flows from that. What would I tell my 13-year-olds? Well, I think what I would say to my 13-year-old self is calm down, stop shooting your mouth off, think carefully through your reaction before you make it, because I was a very, very impetuous young man, and I think that was out of anger to some extent about some of the things that I was experiencing, but they were not good tactics on the whole, and so I think he or if it was my daughter, she wouldn't listen to me, and I'm not sure my daughter has over the years. I don't know whether you know, but my daughter is involved with Chilypep. But nonetheless, I think that those would be that would be me preaching at them. I think that's the best I can do. I hope that satisfies Laura's question anyway. Is there another one?
There is. I think Muskan, have you unmuted to ask the next question?
Yeah.
Awesome. Go ahead.
What are your next steps?
My next steps. And on the activism side, well, actually, it's very interesting you should ask that today. I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but again, I got really angry and stirred up today but only a couple of hours before this started, by some new information that I got about people who are being threatened with losing their jobs because they've gone public in defending Palestinians and Palestinian rights. It's a long and complicated story, but lots and lots of organizations are taking on a definition of anti-Semitism, being against Jews, which is really designed to stop them from raising Palestinian issues. And somebody rang us today about someone who's part of this local activist group, Friends of Palestinians, who's being threatened in various kinds of ways at work. And I immediately began to think about, now how can we get together to defend her, to make the case that this is wrong, what's happening, which other organizations can I call on? I mean, I immediately thought of Liberty, for example, which defends individual human rights in this country, and of which I'm a member, which I haven't mentioned before. I don't know. That's the thing that immediately occurs to me. On the youth work front, I think that what I would want to go on doing, and it's going to be a very, very tricky one when we get to, hopefully, to some post-COVID period, is again begin to make the case for why youth clubs should be restored. Because I don't know whether you've come across these facts, but since 2010, we reckon that we have lost something like seven, oh, I forgot the figures, but huge numbers of youth clubs, and something like 30 or more thousand, 300,000 young people have lost their youth. Very, very big figures of what's been lost. And when we come out of this, there's going to be a lot of competition for money to do all kinds of things. And I see it as absolutely my top priority to, with others, as always, with others, make the case for restoring some of those youth clubs.
Thanks, Bernard. So I think Steph's internet's playing up, the joys of online working.
Yeah,
So Mia, would you mind taking the next question?
Of course.
Thank you.
So the next question is, what do you think about online friends? I met my best friend through a huge group chat, and one of my school friends added me to, and they've been best friends ever since. Sorry, but I've known them much less time than some of my other friends.
That's a very difficult question to ask a dinosaur like me, you know, because I use social media very, very little, and so I find I can't talk about any of that in any personal way. What I am very conscious of and got huge respect and in fact admiration for is the way that your generation and also organizations like Chilypep have used those media to carry on doing absolutely fundamental work with young people and not letting go of the relationships that they had. But the dinosaur in me wants to put a little caution on all of that. For me, youth work has always been about personal relationships, face-to-face personal relationships, young person with young person, and it's been really important as a youth worker to try and support and nurture those and ensure that young people get great things out of them, but also young person to youth worker. And one of the things that I fear is that when we come out of this, and local authorities and the government are short of money, and they've discovered that you can do all this remotely, digitally, much cheaper, they'll say, well, actually, we don't really need youth clubs. We can go on doing it this way. And that for me would be a disaster, because as great as all that is, and what we've just heard, that example is I wouldn't for a moment want to put that down, but I would really worry if that was seen as a total substitute for all young people across the country into the future. We need to restore those direct relationships, young person to young person, young person to adult.
Thank you. So I think, yeah, if COVID's taught us anything, it's that we can do a lot more online, and that is a really positive thing, and a positive thing for a lot of young people as well. But it's having those options, I think, for young people to engage in different ways at different times.
Well, because there is all that evidence out there of how many young people still feel really isolated, really cut off, struggling with their mental health and all the rest of it. And some of that has got to do with the fact that they are being deprived directly of personal relationships with friends, with adults, whoever it might be.
Definitely. We'll go to Muskan now, if you're there.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a time when you've used criticism constructively in regards to your own experiences in youth work?
Oh, I'm not prepared for that. How can I think about that? Oh, one of my problems is that my memory is so bad these days. Actually, I mean, I'm not ducking this question, but it's a really difficult one. I'm looking at my mic.
What was the question?
A practical example of language criticism.
Criticism of you?
Yeah. I'm sorry, my memory's completely defeated me there. I really let you down. I mean, there have been times, where I certainly self-criticism, where I've done things. For example, I've responded to a young person in a way off the cuff, which I realised almost immediately afterwards, but certainly on reflection later. And the way I hoped that I would go back and deal with that, or whoever it was, not just a young person, is to go back and hold my hands up and say, sorry, that was a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Let's start again. And, how can we proceed from there? But a specific example of that, and there must have been many over the years, a specific example of that just absolutely eludes me at the moment. I'm sorry.
Marie has written in the chat, what about criticism to your writing?
Ah, well, that is an ongoing thing. Nothing gets forwarded off my computer until it's been passed by my wife. That's the first thing to say. And some of that is to do with content, obviously, but a lot of it is to do with, is it understandable? The other thing is that I never actually, I don't think now, well, maybe I did in the past, but now nothing ever goes public from me without it having been looked at by a couple of colleagues. So, for example, I now have a blog, which I post something on every month or so. And that blog is actually run for me, administered for me by a colleague. And there's another colleague. And so I just drafted a piece for that. It's gone out to both of those people and said, please come back. And the last piece, for example, one of them had quite a serious criticism of the conclusion I'd reached. And I stopped and thought about it and changed the conclusion. So again, I'm not saying this is 100% or perfect, but one of my commitments is to trying to stay open to criticism of my writing. Where I'm less likely to be influenced by criticism of my writing is when it comes from the people who I'm quite likely to be criticizing myself. And I am prone to try and take on some of the more powerful organizations and interests around youth work, especially where I feel as though they're letting youth work down, or they're letting young people down, or they haven't thought through something, or they're not using their money in the best way. And when that criticism comes back, I measure it against what are their interests here that they're trying to defend. And if I can't convince myself that this is a really quite objective bit of criticism they're making, but it's more making it much more in their own interests, then I'm liable to ignore it, I have to say.
I think we've had a quote that we've said quite a lot in the Gen Z group that is, don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from.
I remember that one, thank you.
But you're going to start talking about Menti then when you said we've been talking about it a lot in the group.
Yeah, I use that a lot. Back to you, Mia, to the question and answer.
Yeah, so the next question is from Sandra Ann, and her question is, what do you think of some of the biggest, wait, sorry, let me start again. What do you think some of, wait, I need my glasses. I'm blind. Okay, let's try that again. What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that youth workers face, and in your professional opinion, what is the way around them? Got there in the end.
Well, some of the challenges obviously come from young people themselves, and I talk about this now very, very cautiously, because it's many, many years since I worked directly, other than today, of course, but I worked directly with young people. I mean, I've got and had teenage grandchildren. And of course, I've had teenage children as well. But neither of that is quite the same thing as relating to them as a youth worker. And it is many, many years since I've been faced with the kind of challenges that they can put up to you. I have to say that given the different world in which youth work operates, the different youth world in which youth work operates, I think I would be very, very challenged indeed. You know, to be sure that I was keeping up with them in their responses to the modern world. I think I'd fall way, way behind in a lot of that, and certainly, you know, some of the more kind of antisocial behaviour stuff that's around amongst that minority of young people is very different from what it was in my day. I mean, when I was a youth worker, going into the club of an evening, I didn't really have to worry about whether the kids were carrying knives, for example. I mean, that is something which is completely would be completely new to me. And even in those days, the threat of drugs was, you know, much less than I think it is now in many ways. There was violence around, and I can remember in one long youth work experience how that ate away at the work until some young people stopped coming, because we would not throw out other groups of young people that they felt they were afraid of, you know. So those have been the challenges. So in terms of challenges in the direct work, I think I'm not now in a good position to kind of talk very convincingly about that. It's all second and third hand. What I'm more aware of are the challenges that are facing youth work as a provision, as a service, and getting money for it. And and it goes back to something I said earlier, what I'm very, very conscious of there is how hard it is to convince people with power, with money, that youth work is something that is at least as valuable to put money into as teaching or social work or careers advice or whatever it might be, because it's so hard to get them to understand just how you get to the best endpoints through that whole way of working as a youth worker. I've not given up on that, and it is quite interesting that there's been some swing back towards that, mainly because people are saying, well, youth workers can deal better with knife crime than other professions and so on, you know, so it's all tied to some of that. But nonetheless, there has been some swing back to accepting that the loss of youth clubs has not been a very good development over the last 10 years. But that for me, you know, given where I stand now, is probably the biggest challenge that I'm trying to deal with.
Thank you. And Muskan, that's the next one.
Do you think national projects like NCS have impacted the rest of your youth work or youth spaces, like put them on back burner?
Well, you've got me on a bit of a hobby horse here, I'm afraid. So beware. I mean, if I talk about not as I talked before about not automatically accepting the criticism that I get from people because of the way I'm critical of other organisations, this would be an example of it. NCS was set up with a very definite set of objectives, quite narrow in many ways, I think, and it has absorbed a lot of money over the years since it was established. just at the time when all those youth clubs were being closed down. And so the other thing about NCS, of course, is that it's for 16 and 17-year-olds, whereas the youth work that I've always been committed to, as Chilypep is demonstrating here, can start back as early as 11 and 12 year olds, and can go on, as Chilypep is demonstrating, into young people's late teens. And so it's covering the whole range of the teenage age group. So devoting such a high proportion of money to such a limited group within that age group seems to me to be a very, very strange thing to be doing when you're taking it away from other kinds of provision. But the other thing is that for me, youth workers, as I said earlier on, they start from defining what they want to young people to get out of it, from what the young people themselves who they meet begin to reveal or say or demonstrate that they would like to take away from it. That for me, it has shown itself over many, many years to be a really, really important thing for groups of young people who are just beginning to think through what the future might hold. NCS starts with some very, very clear objectives of its own. It's about producing good citizens. It's about producing good workers, those kinds of things. And I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to tie myself to those kinds of objectives until I know who these young people are, what they want out of this, and how the process of youth work itself might help them get to that end. So I do have some very, very kind of hard criticisms. I feel there's some very significant limitations to NCS.
Thank you, Bernard. We've just got a couple more questions. I think that was Muskan asking that one, wasn't it? So Mia, you're feeling.
Yeah, so the next question's from Marie, and she asks, given that you've clearly been influenced by those who came before you, how do you think you have influenced those who have come after you?
I don't know. I mean, if I look back on my youth work career, there's a woman who's just about to retire from her job, who was a youth club member and who we're still in touch with, and who is a great friend. And I think who would say she values that friendship. They're very rare. They're not too many of those in my life, but it's certainly one that I greatly value and respect. So hopefully, somewhere along the line, when I was actually working directly with young people, there might be some young people who went away and said, it was worth knowing Bernard Davies, I suppose. Oh yes, my wife just reminded me of one guy who I met as a 12 and 13-year-old at a youth club in Preston, whose only way into the club was through one of the windows at the back of the building, because he was actually banned. And I actually, because of his behaviour in the club, and I actually caught him coming through the window one day and stopped and talked with him. And he's now professor of youth work somewhere on the other side of the country. So maybe there was some impact there. The other thing that I hope I've influenced over the years through my writing, but also through other work that I've done, is that communication about how important youth work is and what it's about and why it needs to be funded. And also the other thing I haven't said is that for many, many years, I was a trainer of youth workers, both full-time job at colleges, but also meeting youth workers on the job and having evening sessions with them and so on. And I hope that some of that's paid off as well in the end. And there have been bits of evidence that it might have done as well.
So it's important to say that Garant has said in the chat, Bernard, you've certainly inspired and influenced me and others throughout my career.
Gosh.
So there has been
Thank you,
inspiration.
Geraint. Thank you. That's very nice to hear.
And on that note, the final question is from Geraint, is where do you think the uniformed organisations fit into youth work?
Yes, my kind of feelings about this have changed over the years, and have often been, you know, kind of a bit mixed feelings, I suppose. But where I stand now is that although again they clearly start from some very definite things that they think they want to make sure young people take away, they are clearly a very, very important and often very useful way for many young people who wouldn't have the opportunities that they provide to do the things that they offer. And they, like all youth clubs, you know, how they do that and how well they do it and what young people take away will vary according to the troop or whatever it might be, and the adults who are involved. That would be true of any youth club as well. And I've seen some lousy youth clubs in my day too, I can tell you. But nonetheless, as organisations, I do have respect for them and have respect for what they're trying to do, especially since they observe those bottom lines for me, that young people join by choice of their own volition and can come and go as they like, and can input into what those organisations are trying to do along the way. And those seem to me to be really, really important basic principles of good youth work practice. And actually, I have to say, although it wasn't the main influence, that youth club that I joined in September 1948, what it was actually called was the Jewish Lads Brigade and Club. And I was required to turn up on parade every Monday night for at least 2 hours in order to be able to be allowed into the club for the rest of the week. So I did have some experience of, I went away on camps, and those camps were great. You know, first time I ever went away without my parents was to a Jewish Lads Brigade camp down on the Kent coast. So I would be the last ones to say, you know, bad words about them.
Great, thank you, Bernard, and thank you so much for your time this evening, talking to us about your activism. I've got one quick question just to sort of sum it all up, because obviously the Gen Z project is around working with young people to run their own campaigns and to train young people up to have that sort of confidence and those networks and those skills to be able to become activists on the issues that matter to them. If you could give one piece of advice to young people on activism and campaigning, what would that one piece of advice be?
Do it together. That's not always easy. Personal relationships can get very difficult. Reconciling, you know, bringing together different priorities that people have can be very painful. But if you don't do it together, you won't do it apart. That's always been one of the basic principles.
Great, thank you. Mia or Muskan, do you have anything to sum up before we end?
I think just like I've said it at the end of all of them, but like just thank you for your time, because I think especially with this one, it's great to see someone who's been involved in activism for so long and how you can still be like inspired and motivated to like be involved in activism after doing it for so long. I just think it's so inspirational and it's just extraordinary. So just like thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mia.
Am I allowed to say something finally?
Of course.
Can I say I've found this an incredibly challenging hour. Really feeling that my brain has got to be as alert as it's ever been. And I want to say this isn't going to be patronising, but it's been as challenging an hour as I've experienced for a long, long time. So, and also for me, great, because, you know, in these situations, you get your own thoughts in order, as well as hopefully making them clear to other people. So thank you very, very much. I've really, really appreciated being part of this. And can I say again, and I think I may have said this before, I think that document that you've produced is amazing. So I hope you make really, really good use of it.
Thank you, Bernard. So I've just got, as always, a quick evaluation form of the session that we've sent out to everyone, and I've not got it open on my screen, so I need to just run around virtually and try and find it. So if anybody wants to ask any more questions very quickly whilst I'm doing that, that would be very appreciated. Sorry, everyone, I should have been more organised.
Oh dear, Ellie.
Honestly, after so long, you
No.
It happens. It's like a brain fart, isn't it? It happens. It's only Tuesday. Still got many more to go. Just look forward to
We're very nearly there, everyone. My computer's decided today is a good day to be slow.
Sandra Ann's just asked me how many Tuesdays until Christmas. I mean, not that I haven't been counting. I can Google it. Gotta love a good old Google.
The evaluation form is now in the chat box, everyone. Thank you for your patience on that. And yeah, thank you again, Bernard, and thank you to Mia and Muskan and Steph, who unfortunately her internet went down, for chairing a wonderful session again.
And I will certainly try to keep track of where you're up to, because you know I've got other involvements with Chilypep as well, and I want to be kept updated about how that campaign and stuff goes. I'm really interested to know. So good luck with that. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and have a lovely week.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.